the document we're going to talk about today. As many of you know, the Center for Education has been working really over the past year and a half to provide urgent support to our missions regarding COVID response and education. And sometime in the, I think, midway last year, maybe in the summer, we held some specific listening sessions with missions to talk in particular about some of the issues that were arising related to youth programming and workforce development programming. And from all of that work, we really saw a need to develop some guidance specifically around youth programming for higher education and workforce development. So we have kind of a suite of different deliverables and learning products are on this topic, and we'll share the link to those later. But this briefer is really focused on the context around higher ed and youth and workforce, and looking at what are the pivots that have been taken and what have our missions already done to respond, and what are some of the priorities going forward that the pandemic has really brought to light. So you'll hear from our speakers really a strong emphasis on going beyond business as usual, and really listening to and kind of taking that urgent call from some of the issues that have risen to the surface as a need to do a lot more. And Rachel, our first speaker, will go into that in more detail. But as you're listening to the presentations, I'm not sure if you've had a chance to look at the briefer yet, but then when you do look at the briefer, of course, after, be thinking about, what can we do differently? What are those outstanding challenges that we still really need to meet, and how can we apply some of the recommendations that have come up from the briefer? So we're going to hope to have some discussion about that with the time we have on the call, but we're also going to be engaging later in the year, and we'll tell you more about that to continue the conversation. So with that, I want to make sure we have enough time to have some discussion and hear from our speakers, of course. So I'm very pleased, as I said, to have the lead writer of the briefer, Rachel Blum, who's a subject matter expert with the DEEP mechanism that we have under the Center for Education. And we also are going to be hearing mission perspectives from Egypt with Wafa El Adawi, who's a program management specialist, and George Kisa, who's based in Kenya and is the regional YALI coordinator. So we're really excited to hear from them. And basically the agenda will be, we are going to first hear kind of an overview of the contents of the briefer from Rachel, and then we'll go into perspectives from Egypt and YALI, and then we'll have some discussion and hopefully hear from you. So please feel free to put any questions, comments in the chat as we go, and we'll try to monitor those and then pull those out so we can speak to those later. So without any further delay, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel to start us off. Thanks, Rachel.
Hi, everyone. I see a lot of familiar faces in the participant chat, so it's really great to see all of you, and thanks for joining. I just want to say, for any of you that have questions or comments, or it sparks any ideas during the conversation, please feel free to use the chat function. We see this as a two-way communication, and so it's great to get your ideas and your inspirations as well throughout the conversation. All right, can we go to the next slide? So we prepared this briefer, which is basically, it's a summary of it's a desk review related to the impact of the COVID-19 crisis on youth education and employment. And we focus on programming considerations for USAID's higher education and youth workforce subsectors. It summarizes findings from probably over 100 policy reports, assessment findings, websites, journal articles, and other great literature. And we looked at the impact of the pandemic on young people in education and employment, and also just the impact on the sector writ large. We provide recommendations in this briefer, and for those of you that are interested in seeing the briefer, the link there is provided in that slide. It's on EduLink. It's pretty easy to find. And we provide recommendations on how USAID, higher education, and youth workforce development could respond to the pandemic, both in the short term and the long term. And we also provide examples of how missions and other programs have already been doing that. We also provide some illustrative interventions. It's a pretty user-friendly document. It's about 14 pages, and it's very navigable, and there's clickable icons. And there's also a one-page list of resources at the back. So if you want to find out more or receive guidance on specific topics, then you can find that there. I also should say that just because everything related to COVID is so new and information is always coming in, so I just give that caveat that the review may not include the most up-to-date literature, and I encourage all of you to continue to visit the EduLinks website if you want to find out the latest and greatest in the research. All right, we'll go to the next slide. So overall, this desk review had one overwhelmingly massive recommendation or finding, and that was a call for policymakers and practitioners to prioritize equity in their programming, and mainly to be more intentional in improving education and employment opportunities for marginalized youth. We see that amid the COVID-19 pandemic, young people have suffered some of the worst effects. Especially those living in low and middle income countries have experienced the greatest levels of educational disruptions. Those from poor households who have limited digital access are also more likely to be out of school. Young people have also experienced some of the greatest job losses compared to adults. And there's some research that suggests that 1 in 6 young people stopped their work altogether due to the pandemic, and many of them also reduced their hours of work. We see that evidence from past crises show that the suspension of young people's education and training and their delayed entry to work could have what they call scarring effects in terms of their educational attainment, and also just over the long term in terms of their job prospects and earnings over their lifetime. So there really are, massive long-term implications of what's happening to young people. The literature also highlighted a few vulnerable youth cohorts who have been especially affected by the crisis. And that includes female youth. That was overwhelmingly one of the findings, that female youth had greater barriers to education even before the pandemic. And since the pandemic, they've demonstrated higher employment and productivity losses compared to men. Also, girls and women experiencing may be experiencing higher levels of intimate partner violence than before the pandemic. And young women and girls living in poverty may be more likely than ever to engage in transactional sex in return for financial or in-kind support. There's also some evidence from the Ebola crisis that suggests that adolescent girls may be experiencing higher levels of unintended pregnancies as well. That might then have impacts in terms of them never returning to school. A second youth cohort that we saw that was of particular interest was the overage learners or out-of-school youth who have not completed their education. Even before the pandemic, there were 200 million adolescents and youth that were out of school. And also, the research suggests that people with lower levels of education have experienced proportionally higher job losses than those who are more educated. We also see young adults ages 18 to 24. There's some research by the ILO that suggests that they've experienced some of the lowest levels of unemployment and mental well-being. Youth with disabilities as well face even greater barriers to education and employment. And then those working in the informal economy are also more likely to be suffering economically. And not surprisingly, that group tends to be comprised of women and youth. We'll go to the next slide. So thinking about those youth cohorts and this overarching theme of equity, the briefer makes recommendations or sort of explores 3 different thematic areas. And the first one is equitable access to education. We saw many examples of how programs have extended distance learning, and I'm sure many of you have direct experience with pivoting USAID programming to distance learning, whether it's through high-tech delivery channels like the mobile phone or internet, or low-tech modalities like distributing education supplies or use of interactive radio and audio instruction. And this brief highlights the resources and best practices that have emerged, since the pandemic. But in addition to that, the research also had several calls for financial supports to prevent mass dropouts. Young people, especially girls and their families, have needed support to pay for school-related fees and also to delay youth's entry into full-time work. So a lot of young people have been, compelled to work on behalf of their family. And so offering some sort of financial means to support young people and their families may have an impact on preventing mass dropouts. We saw examples of programs using creative approaches like cash stimulus payments, use of social protection for young learners and their families, or even things like scholarships, loans, grant assistance, or reduced tuition fees. We also saw examples of private universities also requiring bridge funding to deal with the drops in enrollment since the pandemic. Also related to equitable access to education, the literature talked about the need to adopt flexible approaches as youth return to learning. So the resources section in the briefer highlights the USAID Return to Learning Toolkit, and there's also other resources related to that. We also saw, this is something that I wanted to highlight, which was the need to institutionalize and expand accelerated education programs. So even before the pandemic, many countries had high levels of overage school attendance, and also large groups of out-of-school youth populations. And the pandemic has only magnified that need. And to date, USAID has done a lot at piloting accelerated education programs. And the pandemic, the research talks about how there's a need to really address some of the systemic issues around accelerated education and the need to institutionalize it in terms of the legal and regulatory frameworks and implementation practices that enable youth to access continuous learning pathways. And finally, to promote more equitable access to education, a lot of the literature called for investments to narrow the digital divide. And the briefer offers some examples of how USAID could expand youth access to technology or partner with others that are investing in ICT infrastructure. So we'll go to the next slide. So our second theme is around youth assets and resilience. And by that, we mean the skills and support that young people need to cope with the current situation in the short term, but also build the resilience to be successful over the long term. And also to address or be able to deal with future shocks as they may arise. And a lot of the literature on the COVID-19 pandemic and in higher education and youth workforce development highlighted the importance of soft skills and equipping youth to be successful in the short and long term. Many of you already have a lot of experience with youth programs that are developing soft skills, and the pandemic has only underscored the need for the teaching of these skills to be institutionalized into the education system. So there's a lot of gray literature and reports on that topic. We saw a lot of examples of how programs have used social media and WhatsApp to build trust and community among learners since the pandemic, and the use of things like online breakout groups and chat functions and virtual whiteboards and other two-way engagement to promote interactive instruction so that youth have that kind of learner-centered experiential learning opportunities. We also saw a lot of examples of programs that partnered with employers to offer virtual work-based learning and what people are calling micro-internships. In addition to building soft skills, we also saw examples of institutions that are embedding psychosocial and other cross-sectoral supports into youth workforce development and higher education. So a lot of young people that are experiencing, for example, isolation, or even the gender-based violence, many young people need services that help support their well-being. And so we've seen examples of institutions like universities who've offered hotlines or text-based or online support groups. We also have seen examples of socially distanced youth clubs or sports activities or volunteerism that helps combat the effects of isolation and intimate partner violence. One of the things during the pandemic is that, when you think about offering demand-driven skills or skills that help young people enter employment, that's especially hard to do through distance learning channels, like offering work-based learning or technical training. And so we did see some examples of institutions that are offering things like virtual boot camps or socially distanced hubs for upskilling of youth. We even saw examples of youth gaining work readiness experience through COVID-related health campaigns, or even tutoring young children who maybe need support during distance learning, or other volunteer efforts during the pandemic. So those kinds of volunteer efforts offer them a really valuable source of work experience. Finally, we also saw several policy documents calling for the need to institutionalize digital skills into higher education and workforce development. And when we talk about digital skills, we're actually talking about two things. The first thing we're talking about is the sort of the need that the skills that young people need to navigate technology and to be able to use and create content. And there's actually a really interesting piece of work by the International Telecommunications Union, the ITU, and it's in the resources page of this briefer that's really interesting if you want to find out more about how to institutionalize those digital skills. But also, secondly, digital skills refer to things like online safety skills, or what others call digital citizenship. And during the pandemic, we've seen a proliferation of misinformation and disinformation, and the World Health Organization has called it an infodemic. And so I believe that USAID can play an important role in incorporating digital citizenship into skills development programs. And also can work with young people in the private sector and policymakers to create greater accountability by search engines and social media platforms and other actors who are responsible for spreading disinformation. So there's an interesting opportunity there. Finally, with our third theme, we'll go to the next slide, is youth agency. And by that, we refer to youth's ability to exercise their skills and assets, or their ability to make decisions about their lives. And so a lot of the literature called for the need for young people to be able to take on leadership roles and engage meaningfully in the pandemic response. So we saw examples of young people serving on, COVID crisis task forces, or serving as policy advisors on the COVID response and recovery efforts. One of the most salient findings, and I'm going to the second point, is the call for donor-funded programs to support young entrepreneurs as they endure the economic crisis. So during the pandemic, a lot of countries have enacted movement restrictions, have instituted curfews. This has had a huge effect on young people and on their micro enterprises, and they've been forced into selling their assets and covering their expenses with loans or with savings. And a lot of the literature spoke about the fact that as young people are suffering economically, and their micro enterprises are also suffering, and it could possibly put them into a poverty cycle with long-term consequences. And so a lot of the literature pointed to the need to support young people through that as they endure the crisis. We also saw examples, we also saw a call for policymakers and donors to invest in a youth inclusive economic recovery. So that means supporting programs that support struggling firms that employ young people. This might include things like providing bridge financing, subsidies, or tax relief for small and medium enterprises. It might even include things like providing cash for work interventions so that young people continue working while building their skills for later employment. And so that really, when we talk about bold actions, that might be something that USAID missions may consider, because it might be sort of an out-of-a-box approach. It may require collaboration between education and economic growth programs. And it's really, looking at some of those long-term investments that can help boost a youth-inclusive economic recovery. Last but not least, I just want to mention, I mentioned earlier that young women have been one of the hardest hit groups affected by the pandemic. And this period really presents a unique opportunity to help address some of the barriers to education and employment that young women and girls face. Most of the literature we reviewed really, called for addressing the systemic barriers to female participation in education and employment. So the guidance brief offers some recommendations, like everything from supporting professional networks of young women, developing programs that delay early marriage, reproductive health initiatives that reduce unintended pregnancies, or increasing women's access to technology. So again, this is sort of just a taste of of the things that are in the briefer. I encourage you to look at them more. There's a lot of footnotes and links to the literature and also the resources page. So with that, I think I'll turn it over and maybe allow for, if there's any clarifying questions in the chat, I'll maybe turn it to you, Nancy or Morgan, to field either questions or to continue with the webinar.
Looks like, thanks so much, Rachel. It looks like Suzanne has a question. Has any country provided youth inclusive grants and loans for businesses? And if so, which countries?
So I can't think of specific USAID countries. Actually, there were a couple there, and I'll get that for you and I'll put it in the chat because I can't remember offhand. I did see the World Bank, the Solutions for Youth Employment Program, S4YE, had a lot of examples of grants and loans for businesses, both for youth-owned businesses as well as for employers that hire businesses. So that's definitely a resource to look at. And then I'm just going to do a quick referral, and then I'll write it in the chat of the USAID countries that I saw that there was some examples of that. I think, was it India, Nancy? Do you remember? USAID India was doing
Somalia was as well, I believe.
Yeah, I'll look at that. I'll put that in the chat.
And Colleen, I think you had your hand up, and then Hillary has a question. Colleen, you want to go ahead?
Thank you so much. You briefly talked about disability, and I didn't hear the expanded version of that. Do you have anything else to say about disability within this discussion? Thank you.
Nancy, I'll let you answer that. You actually just talked about that this morning.
Sure. Well, and please fill in if you have other perspectives. Yeah. And sorry, it was Colin, not Colleen. Your name flashed so quickly, I didn't touch it correctly. Yeah, I mean, I think it's certainly an ongoing challenge, but I've been really heartened to see both a lot more attention to the intersection of young people with disabilities and employment programming and the need for stronger strategies around inclusion for that cohort of job seekers, both in terms of research that we're starting, funded out of Washington, to better understand what works and what doesn't in those types of interventions. And then I'm also really excited that many of our missions are starting to develop new programming deliberately around that area. So stay tuned for that. So I think people are taking it seriously, and I'm really, really glad about that. And several of our colleagues out of the missions are on the call that are working on those. So if folks from different countries working on that want to say something about it in the chat box, that would be certainly welcome. And just so we can keep going, I'm gonna call out Hillary Taft's question. She wanted to hear more about micro internships. I know I love that term too. Rachel, do you want to talk about that at all?
Yeah, the one example that I can think of from USAID is in Indonesia. Actually, there's a higher education program that is partnering with employers to offer these micro internships in the technology sector. So they've identified things, they've been working with employers to identify opportunities for where young people can serve in these short-term internships, and get exposure through that. And then I'm going to put that in the chat too, because I know that there's a couple more, and I'll put that in there for you, Hillary, as well.
Great. Well, I know I have additional questions, and so we're going to keep going so we can come back and have some more discussion. Thank you again, Rachel. And now, I mean, based on kind of that overview of some of the things that came out of the briefer, we want to hear from a few perspectives from the field and how they've been responding to COVID, and to kind of reflect some of the issues that Rachel was surfacing. So Wafa El-Adawi from the Egypt mission is going to now share some of their experiences. Go ahead, Wafa. Thanks.
Thank you, Nancy. I'll try to summarize in the 5 minutes that I have here to talk about our lessons learned from the activity that I'm managing, the University Centers for Career Development. Just to give you a quick background on what we are doing in the public universities in Egypt, we don't have this career education. So the the students graduate without career planning or lacking the soft skills that they are required for entering the job market. So as USAID Egypt, and the Office of Education and Health, we thought about that how can we help the young students in equipping them to the job market. So we have our career centers established in public universities. Public universities in Egypt, actually, most of it are the students with high financial need. So this was the perfect thing that we help them to equip them to the job market. So we offer in the career centers all the education planning that the students need, employability skills, which includes job searching, interview techniques, writing resumes, and English, business English, and entrepreneurship courses. So all the different courses that equip them to the job market. So with the pandemic that shocked us in last year, this was really great challenges because the students comes to the career center. So they come and they ask about what services do we offer. We have the classes, which includes our courses. So when the pandemic hit us, we just found that all the universities and the schools were closed. So this was the first challenge that we faced about how can we reach out to our students, how we can offer them the courses, and we don't know how long this will going to take. So we thought about it. We discussed it with our implanting partner, the American University in Cairo, and we think about that we have to shift to the virtual world, which is now the normal world, actually. So the challenges that we face, that we have to ask our training providers that they give in-person courses to shift it to the online courses. Secondly, how we are going to reach out to our students. The campuses are closed, so we relied more on the social media. Each center include a Facebook page. We put on it all the courses that we offer. So everything was shifted to the online courses. Thirdly, as I mentioned about the high financial need, we have also internet connectivity, which was not good, especially in Upper Egypt. So we were able to have internet packages to the students to enable them to be able to join the online courses. Also, the staff were able to have flexible hours because working online, they might have the one-on-one career guidance with the students like in the evening time. So all these challenges where we were working on it to enable and to help the students to get the courses that it is required for the job market. We were also helping by trying to reach out to the private sector, which used to provide internships. So we worked with them to even offer virtual internships. And this was something new for the private sector and also new for the students to have virtual internships, but it worked very well, actually, and it was able to reach out to many students to be having these internships. We thought about that career fairs because we usually have an annual career fair in each center. So how we can do this in the virtual world. So we thought about virtual career fairs, and this was actually happened for the first time at public universities in Egypt. We did this last September. It was only and 3,000 students were able to join this virtual career fair and attend their webinars and have discussions with the private sector, different companies, and put on their resumes and all this discussion. So after 6 months of this first career fair, virtual one, we thought about, okay, let's think about it, why we don't have another one, but this time it's not going to last for one day, but we want it to last like for 1 year. So we worked on it, and last March we had our second career fair, but this time it's still working. It's still a virtual platform which any company can just be there, and also the students can add on the resume, and we are having this as one of the successful things that we having the pandemic actually helped us to reach more virtually the private sector and more students. So I want to share actually with you not only the challenges but the successes as well, that we found out that we can work virtually and we can have career fairs virtually and we can reach out to private sector. All this can happen in online. So even the courses that we provide, we were able in the in-person courses only to have 25 students in one time. But for the online courses, we were able to reach more students, like we can have 40 in one time. So all this was actually, we tried to get opportunities out of this challenge that we faced during the pandemic. And as you see on the screen, we were able in the last year, like from the start of the pandemic in April till this April, to serve over 73,000 of the public university students, and we reach out to them in the different things like the internships, the vacancies, the courses. We have also information sessions that we provide the private sector to come and spend 2 hours to talk about what they are looking for in the students or when they are graduated. So all this was actually a great start for the virtual world that was becoming a normal now. I can talk forever, but for the sake of the time, I have only 5 minutes. So thank you for giving me this opportunity to share our challenges and successes for the University Centers for Career Development activity. And thank you, and I'm open for any questions. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Wafa. Yeah, I mean, I think this issues of how you know, we've already seen a question in the chat about kind of how you overcome some of the internet challenges. You know, it's easy to say that, you know, we provide internet, but then, you know, how does that really work? What are the different options and strategies for different contexts? Maybe we can kind of hold that question, and you can try to think about that and maybe answer that in the chat box, because I think George, our regional YALI coordinator in Kenya, is also going to address the similar angle to kind of pivoting for online services and training. So we'll kind of bring out some points around that after you guys both speak. So George Kisa, our regional YALI coordinator, is going to speak to some of the experiences that YALI has had through this period of time. Very excited to hear from you, George. Take it away.
Thank you, Nancy. Good afternoon, good morning from wherever you are. So I'll speak about the YALI Regional Leadership Center East Africa pivoting and how there was some collaboration. So just for a big background sake, YALI is a Young Africa Leaders Initiative. It's a presidential initiative, and there are 4 centers on the African continent. 2 in West Africa, 1 in Accra, Ghana, serving Anglophone West Africa, and then another one in Dakar, Senegal, serving Francophone West Africa. And then we have a center in Nairobi, Kenya, that serves the East Africa region, and there's a center in Pretoria, South Africa, that serves the Southern Africa region. Next slide. So just similar to what we've had from Egypt, around April of 2020, the government of Kenya closed all public universities, and the center in Nairobi is implemented by Deloitte and Touche, but is hosted at a public university called Kenyatta University. So when the government closed public universities, the universities were given just a few days to send all the students home. At that particular time, the center was hosting participants from 14 countries who are in residence, and they had just completed 2 of a 4-week residential program. So all these participants had to be taken back to their countries. Now, at that particular time, the center in Nairobi did not have a virtual program. And so with the centers closed indefinitely, the center did not know how to proceed with completing the training of that. But we did have some opportunities. From like two years plus before that time, the 4 centers on the continent had already been collaborating. Although the centers are hosted by 4 different IPs, are run by 4 different IPs, and are under 4 different regional missions, they had a collaboration. They've actually engaged, the chiefs of party do engage regularly. The centers also have working groups. We have a curriculum working group, partnership working group, M&D working group. So they all learn from each other, and they all know what each center is doing, some of their strengths. And so the center in Accra, for example, had a very robust virtual program, which the center in Nairobi knew about. So they reached out to USAID, and we had some discussions involving the AO, and then we engaged our counterparts in West Africa, and the two IPs agreed to kind of realign their plans or their programs so that they could synchronize their training and share one virtual learning platform. So they were able to alternate using that platform. And during that time also they engaged the private sector, because some of the content needed to be converted into digital form. But some of those courses already, the private sector had quite similar courses that could be exchanged. And so engaging the private sector, including HP Life, as well as Cisco and Microsoft, they were able to tap into their virtual courses and continue training. And next slide. So the results we got from that is that both the center in Nairobi and in Ghana were able to meet their training targets. Actually, like Nairobi surpassed the training targets, and the pivoting was done in record time. Within just about 6 weeks, they were able to do the pivoting from not having a virtual program to be able to do that. And they were able to share resources with the center in Accra in running this. And that experience has resulted in ongoing plans right now. We are preparing to pilot a continent-wide cohort where participants from all the regions on sub-Saharan Africa will be able to use one platform and run a cohort. This is scheduled for August of this year, so that we can be able to try out that. And the other aspect that happened was initially most of the participants, because they had enrolled for a face-to-face cohort, they were not very happy about doing an online cohort. But eventually when they completed the cohort, they were very happy about the course, because they also gained some ICT skills, and they also started discovering new possibilities, because as they explored, especially some of the courses offered by the private sector, they began to realize they could actually create some job opportunities by just being able to learn these additional skills. So we did learn a number of lessons in this. One of these was that being able to share this platform has great potential to substantially reduce training costs for all the 4 centers. Secondly, we also realized that it really expanded the potential for participants to, in addition to increasing their skills, they're also able to collaborate a lot more, because then they're able to interact even with participants beyond their countries or their regions, but also they become a bit more savvy in the online space, where some of them were not previously very well exposed to. The other lesson we learned is that when you have a quality training, virtual training, you'll have very high retention rates. We had concerns around completion rates, but the completion rates were above 75% all across, and we trained over 900 participants in this particular course. In fact, those who did not complete, because we use our denominator as those who enrolled, were those who were non-starters, meaning that they were unable to start, as I'll be able to talk about that in the next bullets. Because as you notice, I've said virtual training has high retention, but for some participants. So we did have some who were not able to start completely, and these were because they basically did not have internet wherever they are completely. And in some cases, it was not very stable. And for some, the cost of data was very high. I mean, just within the East Africa region, 14 countries, for 5 GB, the cost was as low as $10 for that, to as high as over $160 to be able to access 5 GB. And then the center planned to reimburse their data costs. But then we realized that in some of the countries, even being able to transfer funds was difficult because of very stringent money laundering laws. So those presented some challenges. And so we realized that in-person training is the only option for some of the youth within our region. And so what that means is that we must then be able to map out some of these participants and create opportunities for them when we are doing our face-to-face sessions, so they'll be able to allocate a lot more slots for these particular participants. But otherwise, in terms of the participants by profile, actually we had more completion from female participants than male. About 58% of those who did this were female. We did have participants with disabilities who were able to complete the courses, both with hearing and visual disabilities, although not all of them. It also depended on how well they're exposed to some of these. Then even rural participants, depending on where they are, we did have some who were able to complete the course. So that was our experience, for the early experience on these aspects. Thank you.
Thank you so much, George. And I appreciate you pulling out some of these challenges and particularly related to equity, because that was a theme I wanted to come back to because of the emphasis on that in the guidance document in particular. So maybe Wafa, do you have any thoughts on kind of the equity angle with the Egypt experience and the pivoting to online services for career services? Were there any kind of observations about access among female youth versus young people with disabilities or other profiles that there were challenges or interesting experiences to share?
Yes, thank you. Actually, for the students with disabilities, we are having this as a focus for our career guidance, because they are the ones who really lacks this. So we have a special trainer in each center that we have, especially focusing on training and having career guidance with students with disabilities. So this is an important aspect that we are having in each of our centers, to focus on career guidance for students with disabilities. The other issue about the females, I mean, like most of our students, actually, we have like 60% out of them are females who are getting our services. But I just wanted to share something with you. It might be a different aspect for this, that we found out in some of the Upper Egypt, which it's a bit, there is a traditions there about having the females to be online on camera for with males, with their colleagues males for the virtual courses. So some of them actually requested to have a special courses with only females on online courses, which will give them the freedom to share more without having a male colleagues on the same course together. So, but this was something that happened only in Upper Egypt, but we find that this was okay for us to do for this time and share with them their special, this is a special need, we can have this for them for certain kind of courses. This is what we would like to share, but we are keeping a focus on having the females, and especially in Egypt, it's not easy for them to find employment. So we are increasing our entrepreneurship courses for the males and females, of course, because this will help them after graduation. And we have a lot of success stories for young females that start their entrepreneurship work even in their final year. So, and it will be my pleasure to share the success stories. Actually, we shared some of them on our Facebook page on USAID Egypt. Thank you, and over to you, Nancy.
Excellent. Yeah, I mean, I think that's interesting, that the observation about the more freedom for young women to participate in some of these platforms. We've definitely heard that. I think when we were having our listening session last year with Jordan, that came up through their youth programming as well. So I want to encourage folks to put in comments from what you've been experiencing in your programming in the chat, and then Morgan will help me kind of pull those out. And you know, as we do that, I just kind of want to come back. There's so many issues to touch on, and we certainly don't have time, but I mean, equity was one that we wanted to emphasize, but kind of slightly shifting the other big area, and I think Rachel emphasized this, but we've heard this come out a little bit, and Wafa even saying, you know, more emphasis on entrepreneurship training, this whole piece around the disruption for young people's livelihoods and their income generation activities, largely self-employment, but small wage work businesses that they have, and how much that was disrupted. And I mean, I think a lot of the folks on the call happen to be education officers. And so, you know, one of the things I think about from the way USAID works, unfortunately, is how we can program our funding. And this whole area around support for entrepreneurship and the financial constraints that young people face, and how do we program for that? I mean, I know Rachel has thoughts around, you know, the use of cash transfers. I mean, I'd love to hear from you, Rachel, a little bit more about that. You know, how do we do that within the way USAID structures its programming? Because some of that you can't do with education funding. So how do we make that happen? I mean, across missions. So that's just something that I think about a lot, because if we really see this as a huge challenge, how do we address this practically speaking in our work? So I throw that question out to the group, but I'd love to hear, Rachel, your thoughts on that, and you know, any other angle you want to kind of take with the time we have. You're muted, my dear.
Yeah, it's interesting because, you know, I've tended to be a cynic of, you know, sort of the cash transfer movement, but you know, I think a lot of the evidence is suggesting the impact of, you know, sort of these ongoing cash stimulus payments, you know, even in the U.S., right? And how important that is to the survival of businesses as they endure the pandemic. Same with universal basic income, you know, which is the, you know, recurring payments, the social assistance for low-income families. There was a recent study I saw from the Innovations for Poverty Action that looked at the impact of universal basic income during the pandemic. And it seemed, and it was on, I think it was on youth enterprises or on small and medium enterprises. And, you know, the evidence was really strong for the power of universal basic income in offering that source of support and sustaining these businesses compared to those who weren't receiving the payments. So, you know, yeah, and I mean, you bring up a really good logistical question that I don't have the answers to, other than, you know, I definitely have seen examples of partnerships and coordination. So it might be, you know, looking to, you know, partners like the World Bank or others who maybe have more of that flexibility for cash stimulus payments, and maybe directing it toward participants of USAID youth and higher education programs. You know, or, you know, organizations like, you know, the IRC that are working in refugee populations that maybe have, you know, they've done a lot of work in cash transfers as well. So it does probably require some, you know, extension of partnerships, or, you know, looking to opportunities for coordination, but definitely really powerful. Yeah. And I, you know, so Rosemary, you have a good example there of the Give Directly and how they also have that. So yeah, I think that there's opportunities, but I definitely think that this is something that shouldn't go unnoticed, because I just recently completed an evaluation of an entrepreneurship program, and just, you know, the stories from young people of how they've depleted their savings. You know, they really look to savings as an important source of support. And actually that's something also, that's a way that USAID can support young people in their enterprise and employment journey, is promoting the savings groups and savings. And that's really been a powerful source of resilience among young people. So again, just, you know, look at those financial issues and how they're affecting employment and education. Those are really important.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, and Rosemary, thank you for offering that. I know that this has come up in other discussions we've had. Are there other missions or other folks on the call that want to share perspectives? You just go ahead and raise your hand or jump in to, you know, share their reflections on some of the issues we're talking about. I mean, I think, you know, and
thank you.
Yeah,
thank
go
you,
ahead.
Nancy. Yeah, since there's no hand, I'll just comment that for me, on an individual level, it was really hectic, because we are youth specialists and we are an organization that prides ourselves in terms of youth engagement. This is strategy and things like that. But you see, when you are in trouble, you know your friends when you are in trouble. So we are friends of youth, and for every mission that is on this call or not, like if youth are our friends, for example, how did we mitigate the suffering of young people? We have a lot of resources in terms of humanitarian aid and many other things, and we lobby a lot when it comes to youth. It is not easy to even justify the cost that young people would need actually to be cushioned. Most people who lost employment during the pandemic were young people. They work at the bottom of the pyramid, and when transportation was closed, most of those are in the informal sector, second-hand clothing and items. All those businesses were eroded, for example. And you find yourself as a youth specialist pleading with humanitarian organizations like, please remember youth, remember youth. So when young people are suffering like that, I think we're just increasing the cases of crime and things like that. It is very easy to talk about people with HIV, people living with disability and things like that. But I think maybe to find a better language to frame the issues of youth so that this thing does not repeat. We neglected the youth during the pandemic. We budgeted for other things, but it was very difficult to justify the cost of young people. Even we are discussing about like online distance training and things like that. It is not easy with technical training to transfer those things abruptly. But with proper planning, I think that we really got an opportunity to plan better, not just for the pandemic, but for many other young people who would prefer to hustle other than go for a training. I'll give you an example of Give Directly, for example. They were giving $30 a month. And some of our trainings, you'll take young people to training. It is a month, and maybe it is more than $100, for example. So with those little money, when you follow up, like Rachel is saying, the stories of youth, young people were able to make big changes in their lives. They were able to move quickly to get out of the city, to go to the rural area, to invest a little bit of money in small businesses or many other ways that could help them in terms of using that money over a longer period than staying in the city. There are very, very many examples of when we give cash to young people with that independence, it empowers them to make decisions. I'll stop there. Over.
Wow, very well said, Rosemary. Thank you so much for sharing that. I see some more discussion here about virtual internships. And yes, this idea of engaging the private sector partners and this role of partnerships. I think George highlighted that in his speaking, his talking points, and Rachel, you were pulling that out as some options for some of these elements, whether it's the curriculum or the internet access. But Rosemary, I mean, I don't know if we have a ton of time. I'm going to turn it over to Morgan to kind of wrap up. But I think your point about reframing, I'm intrigued by that. I don't know if you can say anything that in the chat box about how we reframe the discussion. I think you were saying to make sure that we are able to support youth. I thought that was, I'd love to hear more about that. But I know we only have a few minutes, so I want to turn it over to Morgan to share some information on how we're going forward and to wrap up. Morgan.
Thank you, Nancy, and thank you to everybody who's on the call today for sharing your questions and engaging in the discussion as we all kind of try and figure out how to address some of these pandemic era and post-pandemic era realities that we're all going to have to integrate into our higher education and youth workforce programming moving forward. As we draw to a close, I do want to take a moment to thank our presenters, Rachel, Wafa, and George, for sharing their work and their experiences with us today. Listening to this conversation, I hear themes that resonate across USAID's work, especially including a call for increased attention on inclusion, especially for people with disabilities, for young women, across our work and across all of our portfolios. So as a little bit of a wrap up, as far as next steps, the recording from this webinar, as well as some of the main discussion points and the briefer will all be made available on education links. Rachel included a link in her presentation, but we will have this presentation, a lot of the summaries from the chat, and all of that good information on education links for you to refer to later. Additionally, we don't want this discussion to end here. So USAID plans to integrate a follow-up discussion on a lot of these recommendations offered in the briefer as part of YP2LE's Learning Summit in early November, so November 2nd and 3rd. So stay tuned for a save the date for that event to be circulated soon. One last thank you for all of you joining today. We've really enjoyed hearing your experiences. And again, we want this discussion to continue. So please you know, join the Learning Summit, go back and look at our resources and a briefer. And on this final slide, feel free to reach out to Nancy, myself, or Rebecca Schultz listed here if you have any further questions. But thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you.